The sea, we picture calm waters, maybe a gentle breeze, a relaxing vacation, but that wasn't the reality for most of human history, especially not in the 15th century. Imagine for a moment, no weather forecasts, no radar, no emergency beacons, just you, a wooden ship, and the vast, unpredictable ocean. The ocean back then, it wasn't just a body of water. It was a living, breathing entity, capable of unimaginable fury. A storm could appear seemingly out of nowhere. One minute, you're sailing under a clear sky. The next, monstrous waves are crashing over the deck. The wind is screaming through the rigging, and the ship is being tossed around like a toy. The wood groans under the strain. You're drenched, freezing, and clinging to anything you can find just to stay on board. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. These weren't the sturdy steel behemoths we have today. These were relatively small wooden vessels, vulnerable. The ropes could snap, the sails could tear, the hull could split open, and if any of that happened, well, you were at the mercy of the sea. A graveyard waited at the bottom of every ocean, and it wasn't just the storms you had to worry about. There were the hidden dangers too, the reefs, the shallows, the unpredictable currents, all waiting to tear the bottom out of your ship. And then there was the sheer isolation. Days, weeks, sometimes months without seeing land. The constant horizon, the endless expanse of water, it could drive a man mad. Imagine the crushing weight of knowing that you are so far from anything familiar, that the slightest mistake could mean your doom, and that no one would even know what happened to you. Seafaring in the 15th century was inherently dangerous. It was a gamble, a test of courage, skill, and sheer luck. And yet, men still sailed, driven by ambition, by greed, by a thirst for adventure, or simply by the need to find a new trade route, a new source of wealth. And that brings us to our story. A story of one of the most famous voyages in history, and one of the most controversial figures in history. A man driven by a bold, perhaps even reckless, vision. A man named Christopher Columbus. Now, Columbus wasn't the first to think the world was round. That idea had been around for centuries. But he was one of the first to seriously believe that he could sail west to reach the East Indies. See, Europe wanted spices. Spices were more than just flavor. They were preservatives, medicines, and symbols of status. The problem: the traditional routes to the east were long, dangerous, and controlled by other powers. Columbus believed he had a better idea: sail west across the Atlantic. He thought the journey would be shorter than it actually was, drastically underestimating the size of the Earth, and completely unaware that an entire double continent lay in his path. His maps were, well, let's just say they were optimistic. He pitched his plan to several European monarchs, seeking funding and support. He was turned down multiple times. Portugal, England, France. They all saw the risks as too great, the potential reward too uncertain. Either they knew more than Columbus, or they were more realistic, or maybe a little more cowardly in the face of such a huge undertaking. But finally, in 1492, he found his backers, Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand of Spain, recently flush with funds after winning the Reconquista, expelling the Moors from Granada, agreed to finance his expedition. Spain was hungry for wealth and power, and Columbus's plan, however improbable, offered a chance to gain a significant advantage over their rivals. So with royal approval and a small fleet of 3 ships, the Niña, the Pinta, and the Santa María, Columbus set sail from Palos de la Frontera, Spain in August of 1492. His goal? To find a new route to the East Indies. His reality? About to be a whole lot more complicated and a whole lot more dangerous. He had no idea what was about to happen. None of them did. Recruiting a crew for a voyage into the complete unknown, well, that wasn't exactly a walk in the park. Columbus, bless his ambitious heart, wasn't exactly swimming in volunteers. Imagine trying to convince people to sail off the edge of the world, literally. Most folks back then thought the earth was flat, and they weren't exactly keen on the idea of tumbling off into the abyss. So who did sign up? It was a mixed bag, to say the least. We're talking about seasoned sailors, sure, but also, well, let's just say not everyone was there for the sheer love of maritime exploration. You had your hardened mariners, guys who knew the ropes, quite literally, and could navigate by the stars in their sleep. They were crucial, of course. Without them, Columbus wouldn't have gotten past the harbor. But then you had your less savory characters, men trying to escape debts, maybe a brush with the law, or just looking for a fresh start, no matter how risky. The Spanish crown even offered a sort of get-out-of-jail-free card, pardons for certain criminals willing to take the plunge. Now, I'm not saying the Niña, the Pinta, and the Santa María were floating prisons, but, well, you get the idea. It wasn't the most upstanding group of individuals, which you know makes shipboard life super interesting, right? Think reality TV, but with scurvy and potential mutiny. Getting experienced sailors was hard for another reason too, the pay. Columbus had to compete with the going rate for normal trading or fishing voyages, and his was a much bigger risk for the average sailor. He even had to front some of the costs to get them to sign on mines, things like new doublets and hose, maybe a cloak. It wasn't much, but it would hopefully entice a sailor to sign on and not jump ship before they even left the dock. Columbus was also really lucky that he had some powerful friends, the Pinzon brothers, Martin Alonso and Vicente Yanez. They were respected shipowners and navigators from Palos, and they used their own reputation and resources to help Columbus gather his crew. That helped a lot. The officers, of course, were a different story. Columbus trusted them a lot more, naturally. They were mostly experienced, loyal, and shared his vision, or at least pretended to. They were vital for enforcing discipline and maintaining order on what was likely to be a long and difficult voyage. So you've got your skilled navigators, your desperate debtors, your pardoned criminals, all crammed together on 3 tiny ships, sailing into the unknown. What could possibly go wrong? Now let's talk about the departure. Palos de la Frontera, a small port town in southern Spain, was the stage for this momentous occasion. Picture this: a crisp morning, the air filled with the salty tang of the sea. The 3 ships, the Santa María, the Niña, and the Pinta, bobbing gently in the harbor, their sails furled, waiting to be unfurled. The townspeople gathered on the docks, a mix of curiosity, excitement, and a healthy dose of apprehension etched on their faces. This wasn't just another trading voyage. This was something different, something potentially world-changing, or potentially a complete disaster. And everyone knew it. For the crew, emotions were probably running even higher. Some were likely excited by the prospect of adventure, the lure of the unknown. Others, well, they were probably regretting their life choices at this point. Think about it. Leaving behind everything you know, your family, your friends, your entire world, for a journey with an uncertain destination and even more uncertain prospects. You can imagine the wives, mothers, and sweethearts clinging to their loved ones, tears streaming down their faces. This wasn't just a temporary separation. This was a farewell with a very real chance of being permanent. There were prayers whispered, blessings given, promises made. Columbus, ever the showman, likely gave a rousing speech, full of grand pronouncements and promises of riches and glory. He had to keep morale high, after all, but even his most ardent supporters must have felt a twinge of doubt as the ships prepared to cast off. The air was thick with the scent of incense as priests offered blessings for a safe voyage. Banners bearing the royal crest of Spain fluttered in the breeze, a symbol of the power and ambition backing this audacious expedition. And then, the moment arrived. Ropes were cast off, sails were unfurled, catching the wind like giant white wings. The ship slowly began to move, inching away from the dock, away from the familiar shores of Spain, and towards the vast unknown expanse of the Atlantic. The crowd on the dock grew quieter as the ships gained momentum, their figures waving until they were just tiny specks on the horizon. It was a poignant scene, a farewell to everything they knew, a step into the void. As the ships sailed further and further away, the reality of the situation must have sunk in for everyone on board. There was no turning back now. They were committed. For better or for worse, they were sailing into history, into the unknown, with nothing but their courage, their skills, and a healthy dose of hope to guide them. It had to have been pretty scary, even for Columbus, but they were on their way. The die was cast. The first voyage into the New World was finally underway. And you know what? That's just the beginning of the story. That's where the fun really starts. So stick around because trust me, you are not going to want to miss what happens next. Alright, settle in folks. Let's talk about what life was really like down below deck on the Santa Maria. It wasn't exactly smooth sailing or comfortable living. Imagine squeezing yourself into a space smaller than your bedroom. Then imagine that space shared with dozens of other aromatic individuals. The ship's hold, where most of the crew bunked, was basically a floating, dimly lit and perpetually damp dungeon. Sunlight, a rare and precious commodity. The only light sources were flickering oil lamps that cast long, dancing shadows and did little to dispel the gloom. Forget about privacy. Personal space, a concept lost at sea. You were shoulder to shoulder, back to back, snore to snore with your shipmates. Every cough, every groan, every bodily function was shared intimately with everyone else. Ventilation? Well, let's just say the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. A potent cocktail of sweat, unwashed bodies, stale food, and less pleasant human byproducts. The smell alone could knock you sideways, and it only got worse as the voyage dragged on. Remember, these guys weren't showering, maybe a quick splash of seawater if they were lucky, but hygiene was definitely not a priority. Now, picture your sleeping arrangements. We're not talking comfy mattresses and fluffy pillows. Most of the crew slept on the hard wooden deck. Maybe you had a thin straw-filled mattress, more like a glorified sack, that did little to cushion your bones. And trust me, those sacks weren't exactly clean. They were breeding grounds for all sorts of delightful creatures, bedbugs, fleas, lice, a veritable ecosystem thriving in the warmth of human bodies. And speaking of creatures, rats were a huge problem. They were everywhere, gnawing on ropes, stealing food, and generally making a nuisance of themselves. Oh, and they weren't exactly shy. Waking up to a rat scurrying across your face, a nightly occurrence. Think of them as furry alarm clocks. But the rats weren't just annoying, they were also dangerous. They carried diseases, and their bites could easily become infected. With no antibiotics or proper medical care, even a small wound could turn deadly. The hold was also damp, constantly damp. Seawater sloshed in through cracks in the hull, creating a breeding ground for mold and mildew. Everything felt clammy and cold, and there was a perpetual risk of slipping and falling on the wet deck. Imagine trying to sleep in that environment. The constant rocking of the ship, the creaking and groaning of the timbers, the smell, the rats, the damp. It was a sensory assault that would drive anyone to the brink of madness. Sleep deprivation was rampant, and the crew was perpetually exhausted. And trust me, tired sailors are grumpy sailors. Speaking of exhaustion, life at sea was physically demanding. Hauling ropes, climbing masts, swabbing decks, it was all incredibly hard work. And with the poor diet and lack of sleep, the crew was constantly battling fatigue. But the cramped and unsanitary conditions weren't just uncomfortable, they were also a major health hazard. Diseases spread like wildfire in the close confines of the ship. Dysentery, typhus, and other infectious illnesses were rampant. And with no doctors or proper medical care, the mortality rate was terrifyingly high. And then of course there was scurvy, a vitamin C deficiency that caused bleeding gums, loose teeth, and ultimately, death. We'll talk more about that later, but trust me, it wasn't pretty. So yeah, life below deck on the Santa Maria was pretty grim. Cramped, dark, smelly, damp, and disease-ridden. It was a testament to the human spirit that anyone survived those voyages. But hey, at least they had a good story to tell, if they lived to tell it. It's easy to romanticize the age of exploration, to imagine brave sailors charting unknown waters and discovering new worlds. But the reality was far less glamorous. For the average sailor, life on board Columbus's ship was a constant struggle against hunger, disease, and the sheer awfulness of their living conditions. Next time you're feeling a bit cramped on a long bus ride or struggling to sleep on a noisy train, just remember those poor souls crammed into the hold of the Santa Maria. Suddenly your situation doesn't seem so bad, does it? And to really put things into perspective, imagine having a really bad cold. Your head is pounding, you're coughing, you're stuffed up. Now imagine having that cold but also being seasick, sleep deprived, and surrounded by the odors we've already described. Oh, and you're also constantly working, hauling ropes, and trying not to fall overboard. Yeah, that's a good snapshot of life in the hold, just in case you still had any romantic notions about sailing back then. It was, quite simply, brutal. And it's a stark reminder of just how much we take for granted in our modern sanitized world. Alright, settle in friends, let's talk about mealtime on Columbus's first voyage. If you think airplane food is bad, just imagine being stuck on a tiny wooden ship in the middle of the ocean in 1492. It wasn't exactly a gourmet experience, to say the least. Food supplies were one of the biggest challenges. Remember, refrigeration didn't exist, so forget about fresh anything after a week or so. The goal was preservation, and that meant, well, things got interesting. The main staple was hardtack, also known as ship's biscuits. These were basically rock-hard crackers made from flour and water. Think of them as medieval biscotti, but without the almond flavor and a whole lot more weevils. These biscuits were baked multiple times to remove moisture, making them incredibly durable, or so you'd think. They could last for months, theoretically. But they also attracted every kind of creepy crawly you can imagine. Weevils, worms, maggots. They all loved hardtack. The sailors would tap the biscuits on the table to dislodge some of the critters before eating, or they'd dunk them in their drinks. Some would try to bake them again to kill off the bugs. They weren't really eating with the weevils, they were trying not to eat as many weevils. Meat was another essential part of the diet, primarily salted pork or beef. Salting was the only way to keep it from rotting on the long journey. Now I say meat, but often it was more like petrified leather. The salt drew out all the moisture, making it incredibly tough and chewy. Think beef jerky, but aged for several years and with the added bonus of a questionable aroma. You'd have to soak this stuff overnight just to make it even remotely edible. Peas and beans were also part of the ration, mostly dried. They provided some much-needed protein and fiber, but again, they weren't exactly a culinary delight. Imagine eating dried peas and beans every single day for months. It probably led to some rather unpleasant side effects for the crew, if you catch my drift. And don't even get me started on the water situation. Fresh water was incredibly precious on these voyages. They stored it in wooden barrels, and it quickly became contaminated with algae, bacteria, and, well, you can imagine. After a few weeks it turned green, slimy, and tasted absolutely disgusting. To mask the flavor, sailors often mixed it with wine or beer, if they had any. You'd have to drink something, but even that was rationed. You see, liquids took up precious space in the hold of the ship. Wine wasn't just for masking water's flavor, it was safer to drink than water in some cases, as the alcohol content helped kill off some of the bacteria. Plus, Plus, a little bit of booze can help with morale on a long, stressful voyage, right? So picture this. You're crammed below deck, surrounded by snoring shipmates, the stench of unwashed bodies, and the constant rocking of the ship. You're eating rock-hard biscuits filled with bugs, chewing on leathery salted pork, and drinking green slimy water or watered-down wine. Sounds appetizing, doesn't it? But the worst part of this culinary nightmare was the growing threat of scurvy. Scurvy, as you may know, is caused by a severe deficiency of vitamin C. Without it, your body starts to break down, your gums bleed, your teeth loosen, old wounds reopen, and you feel incredibly weak and fatigued. It's a truly horrible disease, and it was rampant on long sea voyages. Seamen knew that citrus fruits could prevent scurvy, but they didn't understand why. The link between vitamin C and the disease wasn't discovered until centuries later, and citrus fruits, of course, spoiled quickly, so they weren't a practical option for long voyages. Imagine being at sea for weeks, maybe months, with this awful diet. You're constantly hungry, thirsty, and feeling weaker every day. You see your shipmates developing the telltale signs of scurvy, bleeding gums, sores that won't heal. The smell of rotting flesh becomes a constant companion. Columbus himself was no exception. He was a devout Christian, and he believed that his voyage was divinely ordained, that God had chosen him to spread the gospel to new lands. This belief gave him the confidence to persevere, even when his crew was on the verge of mutiny and supplies were running low. He felt chosen, so, as Columbus sailed westward, he was guided not just by the compass and the stars, but by a complex web of beliefs, fears, and hopes. He was a man of his time, a product of a world where science and superstition were intertwined. His voyage was a testament to human ingenuity and courage, but also a reminder of the power of belief and the enduring mystery of the sea. It's kind of comforting, isn't it? Alright, settle in, folks. Let's talk about keeping order on those tiny ships, bobbing along in the middle of nowhere. You can imagine shoving a bunch of men, and they were all men, mind you, into a cramped space, thousands of miles from home. Well, it was a recipe for, shall we say, robust disagreements. Columbus knew this, of course. He wasn't just a dreamer. He was a pragmatist, even if sometimes that pragmatism leaned a little heavy on the forceful side. So he laid down the law, and I mean the law. His word was basically gospel, at least as far as the ships were concerned. Think of him as the judge, jury, and, well, you get the picture. Disobeying orders, questioning his authority, slacking off on duties. These were serious offenses, and Columbus, he wasn't shy about dishing out punishments. Now, what kind of punishments are we talking about? What kind of punishments are we talking about? Well, it wasn't exactly a walk in the park. For minor infractions, things like being late for a watch, or maybe a bit of backchat, a common penalty was extra duty. Scrubbing the decks, swabbing the, well, everything really. Basically anything unpleasant and exhausting. Makes sense, right? A little extra work to remind you who's boss. But for more serious offenses, things got interesting. Flogging was a big one. Being tied to the mast and whipped. How many lashes you got depended on the severity of the crime. And yeah, it was as brutal as it sounds. This also gave the crew a chance to stretch their legs on dry land. Weeks of being cooped up on those ships, constantly rolling and pitching. I imagine they were all a little wobbly when they first stepped ashore. A chance to walk on solid ground, feel the earth beneath their feet. It must have felt wonderful. Also, important for the health of the crew to give them a space to exercise. Walking even a bit was better than being cooped up on the ship, and was surely welcome. The Canaries offered more than just physical relief, though. It was a brief, almost surreal encounter with civilization after weeks of isolation. Think of the sounds, the smells, the sights, the bustling markets, the chatter of the locals, the vibrant colors of the islands, a stark contrast to the monotonous gray of the ocean and the cramped confines of the ship. Of course, it wasn't all sunshine and roses. There were probably some cultural differences to navigate. The The locals spoke Spanish, but with their own regional accent. And let's not forget the potential for other distractions. A bunch of sailors ashore for the first time in weeks. Well, you can probably imagine the sorts of temptations they encountered. I also imagine there may have been some trouble as Columbus looked to restock his ship and his men tried to buy local goods. With sailors from all over Europe, some would have been speaking different languages and haggling prices in different forms of currency. I bet some arguments broke out as people got frustrated with the process. And that brings up an interesting point. The crew. We keep talking about the crew, but who were these guys? Mostly Spaniards, of course, but a real mix of characters. Experienced sailors, yes, but also, well, let's just say some of them weren't exactly the cream of Spanish society. Some were probably avoiding the law, others were looking for a fresh start, and some were probably just lost. Regardless, they were all united by one thing, the hope of finding something better, something richer, something more on the other side of the ocean. And while that hope may have been strong, it was also starting to fray around the edges. The Canaries were a brief reminder of what they were leaving behind, of the comforts and familiarities of home. The longer they stayed, the harder it might be to push on into the unknown. So after a few days, maybe a week, the ships were restocked, the repairs were made, and the crew was, well, let's just say they were ready to get back to sea. Maybe a little too ready. With a last look at the islands fading into the distance, they set sail once more, heading west, into the vast uncertain expanse of the Atlantic. Next stop, well, nobody really knew, and that, my friends, is where the real adventure begins. Alright, settle in folks, because we're about to leave everything familiar behind. The shores of the Canary Islands are shrinking into hazy blue smudges on the horizon, and that's it. That's the last solid ground any of these men will see for weeks, maybe months. Imagine that, months. Just ocean. The mood shifts. You can feel it. Back in Palos, there was bravado, maybe some wide-eyed dreams of gold and glory. In the Canaries, there was a last-minute rush to enjoy dry land, to stock up, to say a few, well, maybe not prayers exactly, but something like it. Now it's just quiet. An uneasy quiet. The kind you get before a storm. See, before now, they were still somewhere on a map, even if they didn't know the exact pin drop location. Somewhere they could theoretically turn around and sail back to. Now, they're leaving the edges of the map behind and sailing straight off the page. Columbus, bless his heart, puts on a brave face. He's still talking about Sipangu, that legendary island of riches, and the Great Khan, and all the spices they're going to bring back. But even he must be feeling it. The weight of responsibility, the gamble he's taken. He's betting not just his reputation, but the lives of these men. And the men, well, they start to look at the water differently. It's not just the waves anymore. It's a vast, empty nothing. It stretches out in every direction, an endless blue-gray void. They start to see faces in the waves, monsters in the depths. Every ripple, every shadow becomes something sinister. Days bleed into each other. The sun rises, bakes them all day, and then sets. Same routine. The sails creak, the ropes strain, the ship groans, and they sail on. Always west, always into the unknown. The stars, once a comfort, now seem to mock them. Columbus is up there every night with his astrolabe and quadrant, squinting, calculating. But how accurate are his calculations? He tells them they're making good time, but how does he know? The stars are just dots. The whispers start. Quiet at first, hushed voices below deck. Doubts, concerns, then louder whispers, arguments. Are we lost? Is he lying to us? Are we going to sail off the edge of the world? Remember, these guys didn't have a super strong understanding of the world. They really did think the world was going to end. The water starts to play tricks on them. Weird reflections, strange currents, things that look like land but aren't. Mirages, and the seaweed. Oh God, the seaweed. Patches of it at first, then bigger clumps, thicker mats. It's like the ocean itself is trying to trap them. The wind dies down. The sails hang limp. The ships drift. The men stare at the seaweed, convinced it's some kind of monstrous grasping thing rising from the depths to drag them down. Fear. It's a living thing on those ships. It creeps into their bones, festers in their minds. They see omens everywhere. A broken mast, a rat scurrying across the deck, a seabird that flies away from them instead of towards them. Everything is a sign. Columbus tries to keep them busy. Drills, cleaning, repairs, anything to keep their minds occupied. But you can't scrub away the fear. You can't repair a broken spirit. He also starts fudging the ship's log, underreporting the distance traveled, telling them they haven't gone as far as they actually have. A little white lie, he probably tells himself, for their own good. But the men aren't stupid. They can feel how long they've been at sea. They know something's not right. The food runs low. The water turns brackish. Scurvy starts to rear its ugly head. Gums bleed, teeth loosen, and the men get weaker, more irritable. The whispers get louder, more angry. Columbus calls a meeting. He stands on the quarterdeck, trying to look confident, authoritative. But the men can see the strain in his face. They can hear the tremor in his voice. He talks about the glory of Spain, the riches that await them, the honor of discovery. But it's not working anymore. Their past glory and riches and honor, they just want to go home. He promises them 3 days, just 3 more days. If they don't find land in 3 days, he'll turn back. He swears it, but even as he says it, he knows he's walking a tightrope. He knows that the slightest misstep, the slightest sign of weakness, and the whole thing could fall apart. He's not just fighting the ocean anymore. He's fighting his own crew, and he's fighting the growing, gnawing fear in his own heart. 3 days, it's all he has left, and the vast empty ocean stretches out before them, silent and indifferent. Ah, the Sargasso Sea. Just the name conjures up images of, well, seaweed, mostly. But imagine being a sailor in Columbus's time, already weeks into a voyage with no land in sight. Your nerves are frayed, your food is questionable, and then this appears. Picture it. You're used to the open ocean, right? Water as far as the eye can see. Maybe a rogue wave or two, but mostly just blue. Then suddenly, everything changes. The water ahead isn't so blue anymore. It's brownish yellowish, and it's covered in something. That something is sargassum, a type of seaweed, but not the kind you see washed up on a beach after a storm. This stuff is everywhere, miles and miles of it, floating on the surface. Now we know today that the Sargasso Sea is a unique ecosystem. It's a calm, relatively warm area in the middle of the Atlantic, a breeding ground for sea turtles and a home for all sorts of interesting creatures. But they didn't know that. All they saw was weed, and a lot of it. The Santa María, the Pinta, and the Niña edged closer, and the crew probably grew quieter and quieter. You can almost feel the tension, can't you? The water thickens, the ships start to slow, the seaweed clumps around the hulls, and that's when the whispers start. We're trapped. The ocean is closing in on us. It's a sign to turn back, because let's be honest, they were already primed to see signs. Every unusual cloud formation, every strange bird, every odd current was being interpreted as a message from someone, God, the sea, fate, whatever they believed in. And this was a pretty unambiguous message as far as they were concerned. Imagine their fears. What if the ships got tangled in the weed, unable to move? What if the seaweed got so thick it blocked the sunlight and they all starved? What if the world was flat and they'd sailed to the edge and were now being swallowed up by some kind of vegetal abyss? Columbus, of course, tried to be reassuring. He wrote in his journal about the sargassum, noting its abundance and speculating about its origin. He tried to sound scientific, rational, but even he must have been a little unnerved. I mean, who wouldn't be? He pointed out that the seaweed seemed to be coming from the west, which could indicate land nearby. He probably emphasized that part, repeated it even, trying to convince himself as much as his crew, but it was hard. The days drifted by, the ships pushed slowly through the Sargassum, and the grumbling grew louder. The thing about the Sargasso Sea is that it can be deceptively calm. The wind often dies down there, and for a sailing ship, no wind means no movement. So add that to the weed, the worries and the dwindling supplies, and you've got a recipe for, well, let's just say it wasn't a happy ship. Columbus had to walk a fine line. He couldn't dismiss the crew's fears entirely. He needed to acknowledge their concerns, show them he understood, but he also couldn't let them spiral into full-blown panic. So he probably spent a lot of time talking, reassuring, promising, maybe even lying a little, saying they were closer to land than they actually were, or that he had a secret map passed down through his family that showed the way, anything to keep them going. And he had to be careful about who he talked to. There were ringleaders, troublemakers, those who were most vocal about their doubts. He needed to keep them on his side, or at least neutralize them. Maybe with a little extra rum, or a private word, or a veiled threat. It wasn't easy being Columbus. The Sargasso Sea tested them. It tested their patience, their faith, their sanity. It amplified their fears and magnified their doubts. It was a physical obstacle, yes, but it was also a psychological one, a barrier in their minds that was just as difficult to overcome as the seaweed itself. And all the while, the ships kept moving, slowly, painstakingly, but they kept moving. The wind picked up now and then, pushing them further west, and the Sargassum eventually began to thin. They emerged from the weed, back into the open ocean, but they were changed. The experience had left its mark. They were more wary, more suspicious, more desperate for land, and Columbus, he was probably even more determined to find it, to prove that all this hardship, all this fear, all this wood had been worth it. The Sargasso Sea, a strange, unsettling place, a test of courage and endurance, and a reminder that even the most rational minds can be swayed by fear and superstition when faced with the unknown. It's just a part of human nature, isn't it? Especially when you are on a long journey with no real end in sight and very little idea what's ahead. The vast ocean, weeks blurring into a seemingly endless horizon. It's easy to imagine the mounting anxiety aboard those ships, wouldn't you think? After all, every day brought them further from the familiar shores of Spain and deeper into, well, nothingness. But as hope dwindled, the crew clung to anything that might suggest land was near. You know, a little sign, a tiny omen, one of the most eagerly awaited signs, birds. Now, not just any birds. Seabirds, of course, were expected. These were, well, just part of the scenery. But land birds, that was different. A small flock of songbirds flitting around the masts. That could ignite a wildfire of hope. Men would crane their necks, whisper excitedly, pointing at these feathered visitors as if they held the very map to paradise. Columbus himself, ever the pragmatist, at least publicly, would offer cautious encouragement. He'd suggest these birds were blown off course from nearby islands. He never wanted to fully commit, you see, in case they were wrong, and the men become more and more disgruntled. A calculated risk, or perhaps a little self-preservation. But imagine the crushing disappointment when days turned into weeks, and no land appeared. Those once welcomed birds then became cruel reminders, illusions, mockery. The ocean, it seemed, was playing with them, a cruel game of cat and mouse. And then there was flotsam, floating debris in the water. Now the ocean is a messy place, even today, but in the 15th century, anything man-made drifting in the waves became intensely significant. A carved piece of wood, could it be from a shipwreck, or, more tantalizingly, debris tossed from shore? The crew would lean over the railing, squinting, trying to decipher the secrets hidden within each floating piece of wood, seaweed, or whatever else the ocean coughed up. Sometimes, branches filled with berries would drift by, and you can bet that sent everyone into a frenzy of excitement. Berries, fruit, something other than hardtack and salted pork. Columbus, he allowed these finds to be examined, maybe even tasted cautiously. He too wanted to believe, and if the berries tasted sweet, not salty, hope would surge anew. Land is close. We are almost there. The shouts would carry across the decks. Of course, the problem with hope built on such fragile evidence is that it could be so easily shattered. The berries might be inedible. The carved wood could simply be a piece of a broken barrel. The ocean, after all, is a vast and indifferent thing. It doesn't care about the dreams or desperation of sailors. It simply is. And so the voyage became a roller coaster of emotions. Euphoria followed by despair. Optimism crashing into bleak resignation. The crew, already weary from the grueling conditions and monotonous diet, were subjected to this emotional torture, really, day after day. There were other omens too, beyond the birds and debris, changes in the color of the water, a sudden shift in the wind, strange cloud formations on the horizon. Each of these was scrutinized, debated, interpreted. Was the water turning a lighter shade of green? A sign of shallower depths, therefore, land nearby, or just a trick of the light? Was the wind shifting to the west, blowing from land, or just a temporary change in the weather patterns? Superstition, of course, played a huge part in all this. Sailors are notoriously superstitious, even today, you know. Back then, with so much unknown, with so much riding on chance, superstition was almost a religion. Whispers about the souls of drowned sailors, of monstrous creatures lurking beneath the waves, of the ocean goddess herself, these filled the long hours of the night watch. A shooting star, a sign of good fortune or impending doom. A school of dolphins leaping near the bow. Were they leading the way or mocking their foolish quest? Columbus, I think, understood the power of these beliefs. He may have dismissed them privately, but he knew that controlling the narrative, manipulating the hopes and fears of his men, was essential to maintaining order. He had to be careful. Too much optimism, and he risked mutiny when it proved false. Too much pessimism, and he risked, well, the same thing. It must have been an incredibly difficult balancing act to navigate not just the ocean, but the minds, the souls of those desperate men aboard those tiny ships, sailing on, day after day, fueled by omens and little more, hope and the ever-present threat of utter despair. I feel for them, don't you? Lost on the trackless ocean, longing for land, wondering if they'd ever return. Okay, let's talk about something a little sneaky. Something that Christopher Columbus did to, well, maybe keep his crew from jumping ship, or worse. See, by this point in the voyage, morale aboard the Santa Maria, the Niña, and the Pinta was plummeting. Weeks and weeks, stretching into months, of open ocean. Imagine it, just blue, 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 day after day. The horizon, a relentless, taunting line. No land, no sign of land, just the creak of the ship, the endless slap of waves, and the growing dread that they were sailing to the edge of the world and about to fall off. And you know, it probably didn't help that the ships themselves weren't exactly luxury liners. Cramped quarters, stale water, and food that was, shall we say, less than appetizing. Plus, the constant fear of storms, disease, and the unknown. Tempers were short, superstitions were running rampant, mutiny was definitely in the air. Now Columbus, being the captain, knew all this. He wasn't stupid. He could see the fear in his men's eyes. He could hear the grumbling, the whispers of discontent. He knew he had to do something, and what he did was, well, let's just say, it wasn't entirely above board. Enter the ship's log. Officially, this was a record of the voyage, including things like the weather, the course they were sailing, and most importantly, the distance they had traveled each day. Now, Columbus kept two logs. One, his true log, was for his eyes only. In it, he meticulously recorded the actual distances they covered. The other, though, the other was for the crew, and in that log, he deliberately underestimated the distance. He fudged the numbers. He made it seem like they weren't sailing quite as far each day as they actually were. Think about it. The crew's biggest fear was that they were sailing too far into the unknown, beyond the point of no return. So if Columbus could convince them that they were making slower progress than they really were, he could, in theory, quell some of that anxiety, keep them from panicking, maintain control. It was a calculated deception, a manipulation of information designed to achieve a specific goal, to keep his crew from turning on him. Now, how exactly did he pull this off? Well, it wasn't like he had GPS or a supercomputer. Remember, these guys were navigating by the stars, with relatively simple instruments, so there was already a certain amount of inherent uncertainty in their calculations. Columbus could exploit that uncertainty. He could, for example, claim that the winds weren't as strong as they actually were, or that the currents were working against them. He could round down the numbers, shaving off a few leagues here and there. A league, by the way, is roughly 3 nautical miles, so a few leagues a day might not seem like much, but over the course of weeks, it could add up. And more importantly, it could make the difference between a crew thinking we're almost there and a crew thinking we're hopelessly lost. It's a bit like telling your kids you're 5 minutes away from their destination, only to drive another 20 minutes. You're trying to avoid the dreaded "are we there yet?" meltdown. He likely downplayed any negative omens, focusing instead on any signs that could be interpreted as promising land. A flock of birds flying overhead, definitely heading towards land. A piece of driftwood floating by, proof that land is near. Even if he wasn't entirely convinced himself, he had to project confidence to maintain the illusion that he knew what he was doing. It was all about psychology, about managing the crew's emotions and fears. Now you might be thinking, wait a minute, wouldn't the crew notice that they were sailing faster than Columbus was reporting? Well, maybe some of them did, but remember, most of these guys weren't skilled navigators. They were sailors, yes, but they weren't necessarily experts in calculating distances and charting courses. They were relying on Columbus, their captain, to tell them where they were and how far they had to go. And even if some of them suspected that Columbus was being less than truthful, what could they do? Challenge him? Risk being accused of insubordination or even mutiny? It was a risky proposition, and besides, there was always the hope, however faint, that Columbus knew what he was doing, that he really was leading them to riches and glory. It's the old faith in the captain trope, really. So Columbus's deception wasn't just about manipulating the log, it was about manipulating perceptions, about controlling the narrative, and ultimately, about maintaining his authority, and it worked, at least for a while. Because as the weeks stretched on, and the distance traveled, even according to Columbus's fudged log, became increasingly alarming, the crew's patience began to wear thin, the grumbling grew louder, the whispers turned into open complaints, and the threat of mutiny loomed larger than ever. Alright, settle in folks, because we're about to hit a real rough patch in our story. Weeks and weeks at sea, nothing but horizon in every direction. You can imagine, the mood wasn't exactly sunshine and rainbows on those ships. Now Columbus, he wasn't dumb. He saw the discontent brewing, the constant grumbling, the way the men were looking at him, less like a leader, more like dinner. He knew he was on the edge of a razor, and one wrong move, well, let's just say there's a reason mutiny is a word. The thing is, these weren't exactly seasoned explorers signing up for glory and adventure. Many were less than reputable. Guys who were maybe trying to outrun the law, or just desperate for a job, any job. They weren't invested in Columbus's grand vision. They were invested in not dying. And right about now, dying of starvation or disease in the middle of the ocean seemed a lot more likely than finding some mythical land of gold. So the whispers started getting louder, the complaints more direct. There were arguments, veiled threats. One night, it all came to a head. Imagine the scene, pitch black, only the dim glow of lanterns swaying on the deck. The air thick with the smell of salt, sweat and, well, unwashed sailors. A group of men, led by one of the more vocal members of the crew, let's call him Ricardo, for now, approached Columbus. Ricardo, he was a big guy, not necessarily smart, but big. and he had a lot of pent-up frustration. Admiral, Ricardo's voice, rough and low, would have cut through the quiet like a rusty knife. We need to talk. Columbus, trying to project an air of calm he probably wasn't feeling, would have replied something like, Ricardo, what seems to be the problem? Can it not wait until morning? Ricardo scoffs. Morning? Admiral, we've had mornings turning into weeks. We're running out of food, out of water, and frankly, out of patience. We've sailed far enough to reach the edge of the world, and we've found nothing. Except more ocean. The other men murmur in agreement, shuffling their feet. You can almost feel the tension crackling in the air. Columbus knew he had to tread carefully. He couldn't afford to show fear, but he also couldn't afford to dismiss their concerns. Men, Columbus would start, his voice loud enough to carry across the deck. I understand your anxieties. This voyage is not easy. It requires courage, perseverance, faith. Ricardo cuts him off. Faith? We're not priests, Admiral. We're sailors. We need food, not faith. Columbus took a deep breath. He knew this was it, the moment of truth. He had two options, force or persuasion. Force would be messy, bloody, and he wasn't sure he had the support to win. Persuasion, well, that was always a gamble, especially with this crowd. He chose persuasion, but not the honest kind. Ricardo, Columbus said, lowering his voice, trying to sound reasonable. I know it seems like we've been sailing forever, but I assure you, we are close. I have seen signs, birds, floating debris, indications that land is near. Now, were these signs real? Maybe, maybe not. Columbus was known to interpret things a little optimistically. He'd been fudging the logbook for weeks, underreporting the distance traveled so the crew wouldn't panic. A few more little white lies weren't going to hurt. Give me 3 more days, Columbus would plead. Just 3 more days. If we don't find land in 3 days, I promise, we turn back. We head straight for Spain. He knew it was a risky promise. Turning back meant admitting failure, facing the wrath of the Spanish monarchs, losing all the potential riches he'd dreamed of. But right now it was the only thing that mattered, keeping the crew from tearing him limb from limb. Ricardo, he looked around at the other men. He could see the exhaustion in their eyes, the desperation. 3 more days. It was something. A glimmer of hope, a chance to avoid a bloody confrontation. 3 days, Admiral, Ricardo questioned, his voice laced with suspicion. And if you're lying? Columbus looked him straight in the eye. If I'm lying, you have my word. You can do with me as you please. It was a bold statement, a dangerous one, but it seemed to work. Ricardo hesitated, then nodded slowly. All right, Admiral, 3 days. But mark my words, if we don't see land, the men dispersed, the tension slowly dissipating like fog in the morning sun. Columbus had bought himself some time, 3 days, but he knew, deep down, that his fate, and the fate of the entire voyage, hung precariously in the balance. If land wasn't sighted within those 3 days, it wouldn't be just a return to Spain, it would be the end of everything. And honestly, folks, can you imagine the pressure? Knowing the fate of your journey, maybe your life, hangs by such a thin thread. That's some serious weight to carry on your shoulders. Columbus went below deck, probably didn't sleep a wink. 3 days to find a whole new world, or face the consequences. Days, weeks blurred together. The relentless rhythm of the waves, the creaks of the wood, the endless horizon. It all threatened to meld into a single monotonous hum. The crew, already strained by weeks of uncertainty, were reaching the breaking point. Whispers of mutiny, once hushed and furtive, now echoed with a growing boldness. Columbus, ever the pragmatist, knew he was walking a tightrope. Then it happened. October 12th. 1492, 2 hours past midnight. According to Columbus's log, the air was thick with anticipation, the watchmen straining their eyes against the inky blackness. Rodrigo de Triana, a sailor aboard the Pinta, stood his lonely vigil high in the crow's nest. He'd been promised a handsome reward by Columbus himself should he be the first to spot land. For weeks this promise fueled his weary hours, an ember of hope in the face of mounting despair. He likely was exhausted and starting to doubt his sanity. Had they gone too far? And then, a break in the darkness, a faint, almost imperceptible glimmer on the horizon. At first he probably questioned his own vision. Was it a trick of the light, a phantom conjured by sleep deprivation and wishful thinking? But no, it persisted, a solid, unwavering form against the inky canvas of the night. "Tierra, tierra," he cried, his voice cracking with a mixture of disbelief and elation. Land, the word ripped through the ship like a jolt of electricity. After all this time, it had paid off. The deck erupted in a cacophony of shouts, cheers, and prayers. Men who had been listless and despondent just moments before were suddenly animated, their faces alight with relief. They scrambled onto the deck, jostling for position, their eyes fixed on the horizon, eager to confirm the miraculous sighting with their own eyes. You can only imagine the pure relief on the watcher's face. Columbus, roused from his sleep, emerged from his cabin, his face etched with a mixture of triumph and profound relief. He had staked everything on this voyage, his reputation, his fortune, his very life. Now it seemed, his gamble had paid off. The crew gave him all the credit. Doubt and trepidation vanished in an instant. The air was thick with excitement. Men embraced each other, weeping openly. They pounded each other on the back, laughing and shouting in joyous disbelief. The long weeks of fear, uncertainty, and simmering resentment were washed away in a tidal wave of relief. The land had kept them alive, it seemed. They had been staring into the abyss, teetering on the brink of despair, convinced that they were sailing towards oblivion. Now salvation was within reach. Land meant fresh water, fresh food, an end to the cramped and unsanitary conditions that had plagued them for so long. Land meant survival, and money. As dawn approached, the shape of the island became clearer, a low-lying silhouette against the brightening sky, fringed with what appeared to be white sandy beaches. Palm trees swayed gently in the breeze. It was a paradise, a beacon of hope after weeks of endless ocean. I can't even imagine the paradise they must have felt. It probably was not reality, but it was their reality. With the sunrise painting the sky in hues of orange and gold, the ships approached the shore. Columbus ordered the ships to anchor just offshore, the crews buzzing with activity, eager to set foot on solid ground once more. He donned his finest attire, a scarlet tunic, a velvet hat, and a gold-encrusted sword. He prepared to formally claim this new land for Spain, meticulously following the protocols and traditions of the time. After loading into the smaller boats, a few men nervously rowed to the land. At first light, the crews rowed ashore. A contingent of armed men, led by Columbus, stepped onto the beach. The sand was white and soft beneath their feet. The air was thick with the scent of unfamiliar vegetation. The anticipation was almost unbearable. Columbus carried the flag. With the royal standard of Spain held high, Columbus formally claimed the island for King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella. He declared it San Salvador, Holy Savior. A notary, Rodrigo de Escobedo, meticulously recorded the event, ensuring its legitimacy in the eyes of the Spanish crown. The document was important. Without it, they were simply trespassing. Kneeling, he offered a prayer of thanks to God for guiding them safely across the ocean. He planted the Spanish flag in the sand, a symbol of possession and dominion. The men cheered, their voices echoing across the empty beach. Columbus, in his journal, described the moment with a mixture of religious fervor and imperial ambition. He saw himself as an instrument of God, divinely appointed to spread the Christian faith and expand the reach of the Spanish Empire. Of course, from our modern perspective, we understand the profound implications of this act. The claiming of this land marked the beginning of a new era, an era of unprecedented cultural exchange, but also of conquest, colonization, and exploitation. The seeds of both progress and destruction were sown on that beach that day. Little did he know what kind of Pandora's box this moment would open. But for Columbus and his crew, at that moment there was only triumph. They had achieved the impossible. They had crossed the ocean, discovered new lands, and expanded the known world. They were heroes destined to be celebrated in the annals of history. Or so they believed. They were also utterly wrong. They were not in the Indies. They had not reached Asia. They had stumbled upon a new continent, a world teeming with life and cultures unknown to Europe. The implications of this discovery would soon become apparent, transforming the course of history forever. This trip would forever change history, but for now they celebrated their arrival, planting a flag, saying their thanks, and wondering what awaited them in this new world. I wonder what their thoughts were at this time. They were likely excited. And so, after what must have felt like an eternity at sea, on October 12, 1492, land was sighted. Finally, imagine the collective sigh of relief, the cheers, the prayers of thanks offered up to the heavens. After weeks of nothing but open ocean, the sight of green, of solid ground, must have been absolutely euphoric. The island they encountered, one of the Bahamas, was named Guanahani by its inhabitants. Columbus naturally, promptly renamed it San Salvador, claiming it for Spain. Now, try to picture this scene. 3 European ships, the Niña, the Pinta, and the Santa María, appearing on the horizon, their sails billowing in the wind. For the Taino people of Guanahani, this must have been an utterly surreal event. They'd never seen anything like these vessels before. Imagine these behemoths emerging from the edge of the world, like something out of a dream, carrying strange men with unusual clothes and beards. What must have been going through their minds? Curiosity, certainly. A little bit of apprehension, perhaps. We can only speculate, of course, but it's easy to imagine their initial reaction being one of cautious intrigue. As the Europeans came ashore, wading through the shallow waters, the Taino gathered on the beach. Columbus, dressed in his finest attire, bearing the flag of Spain, went through the motions of formally claiming the island. I wonder if he felt a little silly, performing this elaborate ritual on a beach, with people who had absolutely no concept of what he was doing. The Taino people, for their part, approached the newcomers with remarkable openness. They were described as being generally peaceful and generous people, and that initial encounter certainly seems to bear that out. They offered the Europeans food, water, and gifts, simple things like cotton thread, parrots, and spears. In return, Columbus gave them trinkets, glass beads, hawk bells, and other small items that seemed to fascinate them. Now let's pause for a moment and consider Columbus's perspective. He wasn't expecting to find a new continent. He was convinced he'd reached the East Indies somewhere near Japan or China. So when he encountered these people, he naturally assumed they were Indians, or at least inhabitants of some island near the Asian mainland. He described them as being, well, let's just say his observations were heavily colored by his own preconceived notions and ambitions. In his journal, Columbus wrote of the Taino's physical appearance, noting their smooth skin, their dark hair, and their seemingly gentle nature. He also, rather pointedly, mentioned their lack of weapons and their apparent naivete. He saw them as being easily influenced, easily controlled. This is where things start to get complicated, to say the least. Columbus, you see, wasn't just an explorer, he was also an imperialist. He was there to claim territory, to find resources, and to establish trade routes for Spain, and he immediately saw the potential in these islands and these people. He wrote about the possibility of converting the Taino to Christianity, seeing it as a relatively simple task, given their apparent docility. He also noted the presence of gold ornaments, however small they may have been, sparking his immediate interest in finding the source of this precious metal. Columbus's initial impressions of the Taino were frankly a mixture of admiration and, well, let's call it strategic calculation. He admired their physical appearance, their generosity, and their apparent lack of guile. but he also saw them as a resource, as potential converts, as a means to an end. His plans started to take shape almost immediately. He envisioned establishing a trading post, a Spanish settlement, a base of operations for further exploration. He believed that these islands could provide Spain with untold riches, with new trade routes to the east, and with a strategic advantage in the global competition for power. And so, in those first few hours on Guanahani, the seeds of colonization were sown. The encounter between two worlds, initially marked by curiosity and generosity, quickly transformed into something far more complex, far more consequential, and ultimately, far more tragic. Columbus, of course, wasn't cruel by intent, not at first. But history shows that he and his ships spelled doom for the people whose land he decided was now Spain's. You know, as an aside, isn't it a little weird that we call them Indians? Like they were literally on the other side of the world from India, and Columbus just assumed. It's just kind of funny how easily history gets made up. Anyway, back to the story. All right, settle in, because things are about to get a little, well, complicated. You see, after that initial moment of land ahoy and the first meetings with the Taino people, things started to get a little less about wide-eyed wonder and a little more about, shall we say, cultural exchange, with a heavy dose of misunderstanding thrown in for good measure. Columbus, bless his optimistic heart, was convinced he was in the Indies. And naturally, if you're in the Indies you trade. He was eager to show off what European civilization could provide, right? So what did the Europeans bring? Well, things like glass beads, hawk bells, those little tinkly bells you put on, you know, hawks, and scraps of cloth. Basically trinkets, things that to European eyes were cheap, but potentially intriguing. The Taino, on the other hand, were far more generous. They offered food, things like yams, corn, and fruit, that the Europeans had never seen before. They also gave cotton yarn, parrots, and even small ornaments made of gold. Now remember, Columbus was looking for gold, so these little trinkets, these tiny ornaments, they were like little sparks of hope that he was on the right track to vast riches. Initially, the exchanges were amicable. The Taino were curious and generous, and the Europeans, well, they were very interested in the gold. But here's where the problems started. You see, the Taino didn't quite grasp the European concept of value in the same way. To them, these gifts were about building relationships, showing hospitality, and sharing resources. It wasn't some sort of transaction of equal value goods. The Europeans, however, saw it as, well, let's just say they weren't exactly giving away their best stuff. Imagine trying to explain the concept of a complex trading system to someone who doesn't even have a word for ownerships in your language. It was that level of difficulty. And then there's the language barrier. Oh, the language barrier. Communication was, to put it mildly, a hilarious disaster. Neither side knew the other's language, of course, so they were left using a mix of gestures, pointing, and I suspect a lot of shouting in the hopes that someone would eventually understand. Columbus had brought along a few men who spoke some Arabic and Hebrew, figuring that might be useful in the Indies. Spoiler alert, it was not. This led to all sorts of misunderstandings. Imagine trying to ask, where does this gold come from, using only hand signals? You might end up accidentally asking, do you worship this gold? Or maybe even, can I have all of your gold right now? Which, you know, probably wasn't the best approach. One incident perfectly illustrates this. Columbus, eager to learn more about the islands, tried to ask the Taino where he could find more gold. Through a series of gestures, he thought he understood that there was a kingdom nearby called Cibal where gold was plentiful. What he didn't understand was that Cibal was actually the Taino word for stone, and they were simply pointing to a mountainous region. So off Columbus went, chasing after a mountain range, convinced he was on the verge of discovering a golden kingdom. And the Taino probably just shrugged and wondered what those strange men were up to now. But beneath the surface of these comical misunderstandings, a darker undercurrent was beginning to emerge. The Europeans, you see, weren't just interested in trading, they were interested in exploiting resources, converting people to Christianity, and ultimately conquering the land. Columbus, in his letters back to Spain, described the Taino as being easily subdued. He wrote about how they were gentle, peaceful, and didn't seem to possess any weapons, and this to Columbus wasn't a sign of their inherent goodness. He saw it as a sign of their weakness. He believed that they would be easily converted to Christianity and easily put to work. And that's where the exploitation begins. It started small, subtle, demanding more gold than the trinkets were worth, taking more food than they offered in return, and then it escalated. There are reports, even in Columbus's own logs, of him beginning to take Taino people captive to bring them back to Spain as interpreters, as slaves, and as proof that he had in fact discovered something worthwhile. He even kidnapped a few to teach them Spanish, so they could then help with the communication issues, which is kind of like solving a problem you created in the first place. These early acts of exploitation, though seemingly minor at the time, were the seeds of a much larger and more devastating tragedy. They set the stage for the colonization of the Americas, the enslavement of indigenous populations, and the destruction of entire cultures. So while the initial encounters between the Europeans and the Taino might seem like a series of comical misunderstandings and innocent exchanges, they were actually the beginning of something far more sinister. A story of greed, exploitation, and the tragic consequences of cultural collision. And it all started with a few glass beads, some hawk bells, and a whole lot of miscommunication. Alright, settle in, because things are about to get a little less settled. We've made landfall. Everyone's happy, right? Well, not exactly. For Columbus, this wasn't just about planting a flag. He had bigger fish to fry, or maybe spices to find. Gold, definitely gold. And that pesky little detail of finding a westward passage to Asia. So time to explore. Now these weren't exactly leisurely island hops. Think less tropical vacation, more frantic treasure hunt with a side of diplomatic awkwardness. Columbus, bless his heart, was convinced he was somewhere near Japan or China. He kept asking the Taino people about Sipangu, that's Marco Polo's name for Japan, and the Great Khan. Imagine the confusion. He was waving around this letter from the Spanish monarchs, addressed to, well, someone who definitely wasn't hanging out in the Bahamas. First stop, Guanahani, which he promptly renamed San Salvador. Pretty sure, but not exactly overflowing with spices or gold-paved streets. He sailed onward, poking around other islands in the Bahamas archipelago. Each island got a new European name: Santa María de la Concepción Fernandina, Isabella, even though the locals already had names for them. It's kind of like going to your neighbor's house and renaming all their pets. A little presumptuous. Columbus was laser-focused on finding something valuable to bring back to Spain. He kept asking about gold. He'd point, gesture, and repeat the word oro with increasing urgency. The Taino, being incredibly generous and hospitable, tried to help. They offered him trinkets, small ornaments made of guanine. Now guanine wasn't pure gold, it was an alloy of gold, silver, and copper. But hey, it looked gold-ish, and it was enough to keep Columbus's hopes alive. He learned that further south, on a larger island, there was supposed to be more gold. This was Cuba. So off they sailed. He landed on the northeastern coast, near what's now Baracoa. He named it Juan, after Prince Juan, the heir to the Spanish throne. Cuba was bigger, definitely more impressive than the little Bahamian islands. Lush, green, with towering palm trees. But still, no gold-paved streets. Now Columbus, remember, still thought he was in Asia. He was absolutely convinced that Cuba was the mainland of China. Can you imagine? He sent out search parties to find, well, I guess he wasn't entirely sure what he was looking for. Maybe silk merchants, tea plantations. He was probably picturing bustling cities and elaborate palaces. Instead, his men stumbled upon more Taino villages. They found friendly people, living in simple homes, cultivating crops like maize, beans and cassava. They saw hammocks, which the Europeans had never seen before and thought were incredibly clever. They saw people smoking tobacco. That was a new one, but no emperors, no silk, no spices. Columbus was perplexed. He sent envoys inland, carrying more letters for the Great Khan. He even had them bring interpreters who spoke Hebrew, Aramaic, and Arabic, because that's what everyone speaks in China. The envoys returned empty-handed, reporting that there were no cities, no trade routes, just more villages. At this point, you'd think Columbus might start to question his assumptions. But no, he doubled down. He decided that if he couldn't find a bustling Asian city, he'd just declare one. He designated a small Taino village as Quinsay, after a city in China described by Marco Polo. Never mind that there was absolutely nothing remotely resembling a city there. It was all wishful thinking. He started getting impatient. He needed to find something to justify this whole expedition. The crew was getting restless, the supplies were dwindling, and the monarchs back in Spain were expecting results. So the search for gold intensified. He started pressing the Taino harder, demanding to know where the gold came from. He even started taking some of them hostage, hoping to force them to reveal the location of the mythical gold mines. This is where things start to get uncomfortable. The Taino, who had initially been so welcoming and generous, began to realize that these strange visitors weren't just curious explorers. They were demanding, intrusive, and, well, kind of scary. The initial goodwill started to erode. There were misunderstandings, tensions, and eventually, small-scale conflicts. Columbus in his journal wrote about the potential to easily subjugate the Taino. He saw them as gentle, docile, and easily controlled. He wrote about how they could be converted to Christianity and used as laborers. It's chilling to read. He was already envisioning the future colonization and exploitation of these people. He explored more of Cuba's coastline, still clinging to the idea that he was on the verge of discovering something amazing. He even sailed into a large bay, thinking it might be a passage to the Indian Ocean. It wasn't. It was just a bay, probably the Bahia de Nuevitas. He eventually realized that Cuba wasn't mainland Asia, though he never fully abandoned the idea. He learned of another large island to the east, called Bohio, which would soon be known as Hispaniola. He heard stories of even more gold there. So naturally, that's where he headed next. This relentless search for gold, for spices, for a passage to the east. It drove everything. It shaped his interactions with the indigenous people, his exploration of the islands, and ultimately, the future of the Americas. It's a fascinating and often disturbing chapter in history, one filled with hope, delusion, greed, and the tragic collision of two very different worlds. All right, settle in, friends. It's time to talk about a bit of a stumble, a pretty significant one actually. We're going to look at when Columbus's flagship, the Santa Maria, well, she ran aground. Yawns, picture this. It's Christmas Eve, 1492. After weeks and weeks of island hopping and exploring this new world, Columbus and his crew were sailing along the coast of Hispaniola. That's modern-day Haiti and the Dominican Republic, in case you were wondering. The night was calm, the sea was gentle, and Columbus, bless his heart, decided he needed some shut-eye. Now keep in mind, this wasn't exactly unheard of. It was common practice for the captain to get some rest, but the Santa Maria was a big ship, and navigating close to shore always carried risks. So Columbus entrusted the helm to a young, inexperienced cabin boy. A cabin boy who unfortunately wasn't quite up to the task. He probably should have trusted someone more experienced, maybe one of the seasoned sailors. But alas, the watch was quiet, maybe too quiet. The young boy, feeling the weight of responsibility, probably a little bored too, let's be honest, decided he needed a break. He handed the helm off to another sailor. A sailor who, wouldn't you know it, also felt the need to rest after a little while. So he in turn passed the steering to, yep, you guessed it, another different cabin boy. Now with two cabin boys calling the shots on the Santa Maria, things started going sideways. It wasn't long before the unthinkable happened. Thump. A sudden jarring shudder ran through the entire ship. Crash. The Santa Maria had run aground on a coral reef. A coral reef just off the coast of what is now Haiti. Not exactly a Merry Christmas. Chaos erupted. Sailors scrambled from their bunks. Shouting filled the air, and Columbus, rudely awakened from his slumber, rushed to the deck to see what had happened. I can only imagine the calm look on his face. He must have been very upset. Despite their best efforts, trying to lighten the ship and row her off the reef, the Santa Maria was stuck fast. The hull had been badly damaged, and water was pouring in. She was listing heavily, and it quickly became clear that she was beyond saving. Just gone. Now you might be thinking, okay, a shipwreck is bad, but they had the Niña and the Pinta, right? And you'd be right. They did have those ships. But remember, Columbus had plans to return to Spain with all three of them, to show off his discoveries and get all the glory. Losing the Santa Maria was a major blow to his plans. Plus, he now had a whole lot of sailors with nothing to do, stuck far away from home. It also was now going to be more difficult to carry all of the food and supplies and artifacts back with him. They were going to have to leave stuff behind. What to do? Well, Columbus being Columbus, he wasn't about to let a little shipwreck ruin his whole expedition. Instead, he saw an opportunity. He decided to use the wreckage of the Santa Maria to build a small fort, a settlement right there on the coast of Hispaniola. He called it La Navidad, meaning the Nativity in Spanish, as it was, after all, Christmas time. How festive. Using timbers salvaged from the wreck, along with local materials, the crew quickly constructed a small fortified compound. It wasn't much, a wooden stockade surrounding a few simple buildings, but it would serve as a base for future expeditions, a little piece of Spain planted firmly in the New World. But who would stay behind? Columbus couldn't possibly take everyone back on the Niña and the Pinta. They just weren't big enough. Plus, he figured leaving a small garrison would be a good way to establish a Spanish presence and continue exploring the island. So he volunteered around 39 men to stay behind. Some were volunteers, eager to seek their fortune. Others, well, let's just say they may have been volunteered more enthusiastically than others. I mean, who would want to stay after a terrible shipwreck? No idea. These men, handpicked by Columbus, included carpenters, shipwrights, a physician, a tailor, and even a gunner. Basically, a small but diverse group of skilled individuals who could in theory survive and thrive in this new land. They were given supplies, what could be salvaged and spared at least, tools and weapons, and instructions to continue exploring, searching for gold, and learning about the local inhabitants. Columbus, ever the optimist, assured them that he would return within a year with more ships and supplies. He painted a picture of riches and glory, of a new world waiting to be conquered. He told them to treat the natives well, to trade fairly, and to establish friendly relations. And then, on January 4th, 1493, Columbus aboard the Niña set sail for Spain, leaving the 39 men of La Navidad to their fate. A fate that unfortunately would be far more tragic than anyone could have imagined. Yawns again, but that, my friends, is a story for another time. For now, just remember the Santa Maria, a Christmas Eve shipwreck, and the birth of La Navidad, a little settlement that would soon face a very turbulent future. Alright, so, the Santa Maria. Yeah, she wasn't looking too good. More shipwreck than ship now, really. I guess you could say she found her final resting place off the coast of Hispaniola. But hey, every cloud, right? This little mishap gave Columbus the perfect excuse to leave a little piece of Spain behind. A tiny outpost, a fort, if you will. Building it wasn't exactly smooth sailing, either. Picture this, you're tired, probably a little seasick still, and your ship just, well, kissed the coral a little too hard. Now you're hauling timbers, probably with a splinter or 2, or 10. They salvaged what they could from the wreck. Planks, nails, anything useful. Columbus, ever the resourceful one, made sure everyone was pulling their weight, or at least looked like they were. The fort itself, nothing fancy. A sturdy wooden palisade, a simple tower, and some basic huts inside, enough to provide shelter and a bit of defense. They christened it La Navidad, meaning the Nativity. A rather optimistic name, considering the circumstances, wouldn't you say? It's supposed to be about new beginnings and, well, things just felt a bit foreboding, if you catch my drift. Now the big question, who gets to stay? Columbus couldn't exactly leave everyone behind. He needed crews for the Niña and Pinta to sail back to Spain, so he handpicked 39 men, 39 souls to be the first European colonists in the New World. It was an interesting selection, let's put it that way. There were sailors, of course, but also a doctor, a carpenter, a tailor. Well, let's just say variety of characters signed up, or were signed up, for the job. There were those genuinely interested in exploring, maybe getting rich, and those, well, who probably wouldn't be missed back in Spain. Think of it as a career opportunity, with a significant amount of risk involved. Columbus, smooth talker that he was, painted a rosy picture. He promised them wealth, adventure, and the glory of establishing a new Spanish territory. He stocked the fort with enough provisions, tools, and trade goods to supposedly last a year. And of course, he left them with strict instructions: be friendly with the locals, continue exploring, and, most importantly, find that gold. He even left them the Santa Maria's cannon, loaded, just in case. Now, here's where things get complicated. Columbus, bless his heart, seemed to have this unwavering belief in the inherent goodness of humanity, or at least, the inherent obedience of his crew. He seemed genuinely convinced that these 39 men, left to their own devices thousands of miles from home, would behave themselves and follow his orders to the letter. Yeah, didn't quite work out that way. See, these weren't exactly model citizens, if we're being honest. A lot of them were itching for adventure, alright, but also pretty quick to get impatient. Add to that the temptation of, well, let's just say the Taino people were generous with their hospitality, and some of the crew took a bit too much liberty with that generosity. And then there's the gold, or rather, the lack of gold. Remember that promise of riches? Yeah, the crew got pretty desperate to find some, and well, let's just say their methods weren't always diplomatic. There were whispers of greed, of infighting, of, well, let's just say some of the crew figured that the Taino women were there for the taking and the gold was just lying around waiting to be liberated. Columbus, in his journals, paints a very different picture, of course. He describes a harmonious relationship between the Spanish and the Taino, a peaceful exchange of goods and knowledge. He downplays, or completely omits, any hint of discord or exploitation, but well, history tells a slightly different story, doesn't it? The seeds of colonization, you see, weren't just about building a fort and planting a flag. They were about power, about control, and unfortunately about exploitation. The men left behind at La Navidad, isolated and driven by greed, quickly began to abuse their position. They started demanding more and more from the Taino, taking their food, their women, and whatever meager gold they could find. They started fighting amongst themselves over the spoils, and they started, well, let's just say they weren't exactly the best ambassadors for the Spanish crown. The Taino, initially welcoming and generous, grew wary, then resentful. They saw their generosity being taken advantage of, their resources plundered, and their way of life threatened. Tensions rose, and, well, it was only a matter of time before things went south. Real south. Columbus, sailing back to Spain with tales of paradise and promises of gold, had no idea what was brewing back at La Navidad. He was too busy envisioning himself as a conquering hero to see the storm clouds gathering on the horizon. The seeds of colonization, planted in the soil of greed and misunderstanding, were about to sprout into something, well, ugly. The story of La Navidad, really, is a foreshadowing. It's a glimpse into the dark side of colonization, the exploitation, the violence, and the devastating consequences for the indigenous people of the Americas. It's a reminder that even the most well-intentioned voyages, and, let's be honest, Columbus's intentions were questionable, can have unintended and tragic consequences. And it all started with 39 men, a shipwrecked boat, and a fort named La Navidad. Alright, settle in folks, because after all the excitement of discovering new lands, finding ourselves shipwrecked, and building our little fort, La Navidad, we now face the long journey back to Spain. And wouldn't you know it, the ocean isn't quite done with us yet. Remember, we're down a ship now. The Santa Maria, well, she's sleeping with the fishes. That leaves us with the Niña and the Pinta, both smaller vessels, now carrying the entire crew and whatever meager treasures we've managed to gather. Cramped quarters. Oh, you bet. Tempers are already fraying pretty thin, I can assure you. Think of it as a very long camping trip with people you really wouldn't have chosen to go camping with. This return trip isn't just about space, though. The Santa Maria wasn't just a ship, it was the flagship, the one Columbus used to navigate. He's now crammed aboard the Niña, and while she's a sturdy little caravel, she's, well, smaller. Navigation feels a bit more precarious, you might say. It's like going from driving a truck to a small car. And the weather, oh the weather. You'd think we'd be due some good fortune after all this, but no, the Atlantic in winter, not exactly known for its calm seas and sunny skies. Storms are practically a daily occurrence. Just imagine, waves crashing over the deck, the ship pitching and rolling violently. Everything's constantly wet, the wind is howling in your ears, and you're doing your best to hold on to something, anything, while trying not to get seasick for the millionth time. It's cozy, not. Remember that fear we talked about, the fear of the unknown during the outward voyage? Well, that's back, but it's a different flavor now. Back then, it was fear of sea monsters and falling off the edge of the world. Now, it's the very real fear of getting swallowed by a rogue wave or running out of supplies before we reach land. And of course, now there's the concern, the gnawing anxiety of how our news will be received back home. Columbus, of course, puts on a brave face. He has to. He's the admiral, the leader. He's trying to project confidence. But you can see it in his eyes, that little flicker of worry. He knows he's gambled everything on this voyage. What if the monarchs, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, aren't impressed? What if they think he's wasted their money on a wild goose chase? What if he doesn't get that title he was promised? He's also fretting about how to explain things. He promised them a westward route to Asia, riches beyond their wildest dreams. And well, he has some islands, some natives, and promises of gold. He doesn't know just how much gold. Will they think it's enough? Then there are the men he left behind at La Navidad. What if they're all dead? What if they've been killed by the natives? What if they've started a war? How does he explain that? He's tasked with founding this colony, and the first message he needs to send is, oh, and by the way, my entire garrison is probably dead. Not exactly the best selling point for future expeditions. He spends hours poring over his charts, double-checking his calculations, trying to find the most favorable winds. He consults with the pilots, Sancho Ruiz de Gama on the Niña, and the Pinzon brothers on the Pinta, Vicente Yanez, and Martin Alonso. There's tension there too. Remember Martin Alonso Pinzon? He wasn't always thrilled about Columbus's leadership, and now, with the stakes so high, those old rivalries are bubbling back to the surface. It's like a pot simmering on the verge of boiling over. There are constant arguments about the course to take, the best way to navigate the storms. Columbus is adamant about sticking to his plan, but Pinzon, ever the independent spirit, has his own ideas. He sees himself as an experienced mariner, equal to Columbus, maybe even superior. It's a power struggle, playing out against the backdrop of a vast and unforgiving ocean. The lack of fresh water is a constant issue too. It's warm in the Caribbean, so the water goes bad quickly. The water casks get contaminated with algae. It tastes foul, and you can only imagine what it's doing to our stomachs. We start rationing it even more severely, which of course only makes everyone crankier. And the food, well, it hasn't gotten any better. We're still eating weevilly biscuits, salted meat that's tougher than leather, and whatever beans haven't rotted. Scurvy is still a threat. The only saving grace is whatever fish we are lucky enough to catch, but that's rare, especially in stormy weather. It makes you understand why sailors looked forward to land. Just the promise of fresh food and fresh water seemed like paradise. Sleep is elusive. Even when you can sleep, the cramped quarters, the constant rocking of the ship, and the anxiety about what awaits them all keep you tossing and turning. You dream of green fields, clear streams, and tables laden with food. Then you wake up to the reality of a cramped bunk, the smell of sweat and seawater, and the groaning of the ship as it battles the waves. Adding to the pressure is the slow pace. The winds aren't always favorable, and sometimes it feels like we're barely moving. Each day that passes increases the risk of running out of supplies. It's a waiting game, a test of endurance, both physical and mental. It's a struggle to keep hope alive, to believe that we'll actually make it back to Spain. It's a slow burn toward home. But who knew how much longer it would all take? Okay, let's talk about a little bit of treachery in the ranks, something that happens even on voyages of discovery, and how this treachery really highlighted the tensions brewing beneath the surface of Columbus's grand adventure. We're heading into the chapter The Pinta's Desertion, facing treachery and a separate course. Now, picture this, weeks, months even, at sea. You're bone-tired, probably sick, and all you've been dreaming about is land. Finally, that dream becomes reality. You've found it. And as quickly as land comes, suddenly the focus shifts. The dream of discovery morphs into something much more self-serving for some. This is exactly what happened with the Pinta and her captain, Martin Alonso Pinzon. Pinzon, by all accounts, was no shrinking violet. He was an experienced seafarer in his own right, a wealthy ship owner from Palos, and he'd even played a key role in getting the reluctant sailors of the area to sign up for Columbus's voyage. But somewhere along the line, something soured between Columbus and Pinzon. Perhaps it was simmering resentment, a feeling of being underappreciated, or maybe it was simply ambition overriding loyalty. Whatever the cause, their relationship deteriorated and distrust festered. We know the Pinta was often the faster of the two caravels, the Niña being the other. It made sense for her to be out scouting, looking for signs of land. But after the initial discoveries in the Bahamas and exploration along the coasts of Cuba and Hispaniola, Pinzon's actions became increasingly suspicious. He seemed less interested in following Columbus's overall strategy and more focused on pursuing his own hunches, his own leads about where to find the real treasures. It all came to a head around November 21st, 1492. The ships were exploring the northeastern coast of Hispaniola, modern-day Haiti and Dominican Republic. Columbus, aboard the Santa María, intended to continue charting the coast, but Pinzon, driven by rumors from the native Taino people, decided he knew better. These rumors spoke of an island called Babaiki, supposedly overflowing with gold. Now this is where the details get a little murky, shrouded in historical biases and conflicting accounts. What's clear is that Pinzon, without Columbus's explicit permission, decided to set off in search of Babaiki. There was a convenient storm that came through, and the Pinta used this to their advantage, separating from the other ships. A story was later concocted about the Pinta becoming separated accidentally during the storm, and that they searched for Columbus and the others. And it's true, storms separate ships pretty easily. But the evidence points to this being a calculated move, a carefully orchestrated defection. Think about it from Pinzon's perspective. He spent months at sea, enduring hardship and risk. Now he believes he's on the verge of finding untold riches. Why share that with Columbus? Why give Columbus all the glory when he, Pinzon, could be the one to return to Spain laden with gold, the hero who truly discovered the wealth of the Indies? It's a heady prospect, a temptation that clearly proved too strong to resist. This wasn't just a simple case of going off course. This was a deliberate act of defiance, a mutiny in all but name. Pinzon was effectively abandoning the expedition, taking a ship and a portion of the crew with him, and it was driven by the most basic of human motivations: greed, ambition, and the desire for personal glory. Columbus, understandably, was furious. He saw Pinzon's departure as a betrayal, a direct challenge to his authority, and a threat to the entire expedition. He recorded his anger in his journal, expressing his disappointment and frustration with Pinzon's actions. He also worried. With a smaller fleet, the return trip would be more dangerous, and he had to wonder how his crew would react, seeing Pinzon essentially get away with taking off. But there was another, even more pressing concern. What if Pinzon made it back to Spain first? What if he presented himself to King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella as the true discoverer of the Indies? What if he undermined Columbus's achievements and stole his reward? It was a very real possibility, and it must have weighed heavily on Columbus's mind as he continued his exploration without the Pinta. Now you might be thinking, well, why didn't Columbus just go after him? And that's a valid question. But remember, Columbus still had a mission to complete. He had to find a passage to the east, secure resources for the return voyage, and establish a settlement on Hispaniola, which is what he ultimately ended up doing after the Santa Maria wrecked. Chasing after Pinzon would have meant abandoning all of that, risking the entire expedition for the sake of personal revenge. It was a calculation he couldn't afford to make. So Columbus pressed on, trying to ignore the gnawing anxiety and the bitter taste of betrayal. He continued to explore the islands, building La Navidad, the fort on Hispaniola, trying to salvage his mission despite Pinzon's treachery. All the while, the thought of Pinzon racing back to Spain, trying to steal his thunder, must have been a constant unwelcome companion. The desertion of the Pinta wasn't just a footnote in the story of Columbus's first voyage. It was a pivotal moment, a stark reminder that even in the midst of grand historical events, human nature, with all its flaws and ambitions, still plays a central role. It also foreshadowed the challenges Columbus would face in the years to come. Challenges of maintaining authority, managing competing interests, and dealing with the inevitable conflicts that arise when greed and ambition collide with the pursuit of discovery. Alright, settle in folks, because this is where things get dicey. We've talked about the dangers of the open ocean, the anxieties that plagued Columbus's crew, but now we're talking about raw, unbridled power. The kind that can swallow ships whole and leave no trace. We're talking about a hurricane. Now these weren't the quaint little rainstorms we might casually ignore today. These were monstrous swirling behemoths of wind and water, and to 15th century sailors, they were practically biblical punishments. No satellite imagery, no weather forecasts, just a growing sense of dread as the skies turned a sickly green, and the ocean began to churn with unnatural violence. Imagine the scene: weeks and weeks at sea, the monotonous rhythm of waves and wind suddenly disrupted by a building tension. The air becomes thick, heavy with humidity. The wind, which had been a relatively steady companion, begins to gust erratically, shifting direction with increasing ferocity. The waves, once predictable, grow taller, steeper, and more menacing. The Niña, now the lead ship after the Santa Maria was wrecked, and the Pinta suddenly found themselves at the mercy of forces far beyond their control. Columbus, a seasoned mariner, would have recognized the signs. The strange calmness before the storm, the unsettling change in the sea's color, the ominous cloud formations gathering on the horizon. He knew that survival depended on immediate action. Orders would have been barked out, though likely muffled by the rising wind. Sails would be furled, or what was left of them after the long journey. Everything on deck that wasn't tied down would have been secured, or more likely tossed overboard to prevent it from becoming a deadly projectile. And then it hit. A wall of wind and rain, so intense it felt like being underwater. The ships, mere specks on a raging ocean, were tossed about like toys. Waves crashed over the decks, threatening to sweep men overboard. The masts groaned and creaked under the strain, threatening to snap at any moment. Down below, in the cramped and stifling confines of the hold, the terror would have been palpable. Men huddled together, praying, weeping, or simply staring blankly ahead, resigned to their fate. The sounds were deafening, the roar of the wind, the crash of waves, the splintering of wood, and the terrified cries of their shipmates. Visibility would have been near zero. The rain was relentless, a solid sheet of water that stung the skin and made it impossible to see more than a few feet. The wind screamed through the rigging, a high-pitched wail that seemed to mock their helplessness. Columbus, despite his fear, would have needed to remain calm, projecting an air of authority and resolve. His experience as a sailor would have been crucial in guiding the remaining ships through the storm, but even his skill could only do so much. The hours that followed were a blur of chaos and terror. The ships were constantly at risk of capsizing, being driven onto shoals, or colliding with each other. The men worked tirelessly, pumping water, repairing damage, and trying to keep the ships afloat. Sleep was impossible, food was forgotten, and every moment felt like their last. Many sailors would have been injured, lashed by flying debris, tossed against bulkheads, or simply exhausted to the point of collapse. The lack of medical care meant that even minor injuries could become life-threatening. Infections would have spread quickly in the damp, unsanitary conditions. What got them through? Sheer, stubborn will. The primal instinct to survive. Faith for many was a powerful motivator. The belief that God would protect them, or at least grant them a merciful death. And of course, the leadership of Columbus, who, whatever his flaws, possessed an unwavering determination to see his voyage through. Slowly, agonizingly, the storm began to abate. The wind lessened, the rain eased, and the waves began to subside. The sky, which had been hidden for so long, finally peeked through the clouds, a pale and watery blue. The aftermath was a scene of devastation. The ships were battered and bruised, their masts damaged, their sails torn. Debris littered the decks, and the air was thick with the smell of salt water and fear. But they were afloat. They had survived. The Niña and Pinta were separated from each other. The first order of business was assessment, checking for structural damage, patching holes, and trying to get a sense of their location. Rations were inventoried, and the grim reality of their depleted supplies became clear. They had weathered the storm, but their ordeal was far from over. They were still thousands of miles from home, with damaged ships, dwindling supplies, and the constant threat of further storms. But they had survived, and that in itself was a victory. The courage needed to face that kind of raw, untamed danger is something most of us couldn't even fathom. The journey home was an adventure to itself, but that tale will be told next episode. So we've weathered that storm, limped our way across the ocean with 2 ships instead of 3, and well, things haven't exactly gotten any easier. In fact, they're about to get a whole lot more complicated. After battling what felt like the entire Atlantic, Columbus and his weary crew finally sighted land again. But this wasn't Spain, it was Portugal, specifically the coast near Lisbon. Now, a little unplanned detour to Portugal wasn't exactly on Columbus's itinerary. He was aiming for Spain, after all. But you know, the sea has a funny way of rewriting your plans. The storm had battered the Niña and the Pinta pretty badly, and Lisbon, whether they liked it or not, was the nearest safe harbor. needs must, right? Think of it like you're driving cross-country and your tire blows out in a town you never intended to visit. You gotta pull over, get it fixed, and maybe grab a questionable burger at the local diner. Lisbon was Columbus's questionable burger stop, only the burger was a royal pain. Now Portugal and Spain weren't exactly best buds back then. Think of them more like competitive siblings, always trying to one-up each other. Portugal, under King John II, was a major maritime power with a well-established route to the Indies around Africa. They'd been at this exploring game for decades, and here comes Columbus, bursting onto the scene with a, well, different idea. As the Niña and Pinta sailed into the Tagus River, the atmosphere was tense, to say the least. Portuguese officials were immediately suspicious. What was this Castilian fleet doing on their doorstep? Especially after sailing west into open ocean, which they considered their domain. Columbus, ever the diplomat, or at least trying to be, sent a message requesting permission to land and repair his ships. Permission was granted, albeit grudgingly. The Portuguese were definitely keeping a close eye on things. You can imagine them muttering, "What's this guy up to?" Once ashore in Lisbon, Columbus faced a rather frosty reception. The Portuguese authorities were quick to point out that, according to the Treaty of Alcáçovas, a treaty which had established zones of influence in the Atlantic Sea, any new lands discovered west of the Canary Islands technically belonged to Portugal. Awkward. Columbus, of course, wasn't having any of that. He insisted he was sailing west to reach the Indies, not to claim new territories in Portugal's sphere of influence. He also rather pointedly mentioned that he was sailing under the flag of Spain, not Portugal. Subtle digs all around, you know. Word of Columbus's arrival quickly reached King John II, who naturally was intensely curious. After all, a Castilian captain claiming to have found a new route to the Indies was, well, it was a direct challenge to Portugal's dominance. King John wasted no time summoning Columbus to him for an audience. Imagine the scene: Columbus, tired, probably a bit seasick, and definitely stressed, standing before the Portuguese king. The air is thick with unspoken rivalry and suspicion. This was a high-stakes meeting, to say the least. King John, a shrewd and experienced ruler, grilled Columbus relentlessly about his voyage. He wanted to know every detail: the route he took, the lands he claimed to have discovered, the people he encountered, and most importantly, the evidence he had to back it all up. Columbus, ever the salesman, laid it on thick. He described the islands he'd found, the exotic people, the gold, the spices, everything designed to impress the king and convince him that this voyage was the real deal. He likely downplayed the length of the voyage and exaggerated the riches he found. You know, a little embellishment never hurt anyone, right? But King John wasn't easily fooled. He had his own experts, his own cartographers, and his own navigators. He knew the seas, and he knew the stakes, and he had a nagging suspicion that Columbus wasn't telling the whole truth. The meeting was tense. King John, while outwardly polite, made it clear he didn't quite believe Columbus's story. He pointed out the inconsistencies, the vagueness, and the lack of solid proof. He even suggested that Columbus had simply stumbled upon some islands in the Atlantic, nothing more. Adding insult to injury, some of King John's advisors even suggested, well, let's just say they weren't particularly subtle. They proposed eliminating Columbus and claiming his discoveries for Portugal, a rather permanent solution, wouldn't you say? Thankfully for Columbus, King John, while ruthless, was also a pragmatist. He knew that outright stealing Columbus's discovery would be a major breach of diplomacy and could lead to war with Spain. And war, well, war is bad for business. He did, however, decide to send a secret expedition to follow Columbus's route and verify his claims. A bit underhanded, but you know, that's politics. The meeting ended without any real resolution. King John allowed Columbus to continue repairing his ships and resupply in Lisbon, but he made it clear that he remained skeptical. Columbus, for his part, was relieved to escape with his life and his ships. He knew he had to get back to Spain as quickly as possible and secure the support of Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand before the Portuguese could make a move. This stop in Lisbon was a crucial moment in Columbus's journey. It wasn't just a pit stop. It was a confrontation with the established maritime power of the age, a challenge to their dominance, and a glimpse into the political machinations that would shape the future of exploration. And as Columbus set sail again, leaving Lisbon behind, he knew the stakes had just gotten a whole lot higher. He wasn't just sailing to discover new lands anymore. He was in a race against time, against Portugal, and against the skepticism of the world, all while sailing on ships that were probably still leaking. Talk about pressure, right? Alright folks, let's talk about the ending of Columbus's first voyage, the triumphant return to Spain. I know, we've gone through a lot to get here, all that scurvy and near mutiny, but hey, every good story needs a happy ending, right? Or at least a seemingly happy one. After surviving that truly terrifying storm, Columbus and his weary crew finally limped their way back across the Atlantic, arriving in Lisbon. Now, this wasn't exactly part of the plan. See, Lisbon was a Portuguese city, and Portugal was, shall we say, not thrilled about Spain suddenly popping up with claims of discovering new lands. There was a bit of a standoff. King John II of Portugal, not one to mince words, basically grilled Columbus about his voyage, wanting to know every detail. It was tense to say the least, but Columbus, ever the diplomat, managed to navigate the situation. He presented himself as a man of peace, simply blown off course by the storm, and after some tense days was allowed to continue his journey back to Spain. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the Niña and the Pinta, remember, the Santa María was at the bottom of the ocean now, sailed into the Spanish port of Palos de la Frontera. This, my friends, was their starting point, where they'd waved goodbye to familiar shores so many months ago. Imagine the emotions, relief, exhaustion, but above all, pride. They'd done it. They'd sailed into the unknown and returned. The atmosphere in Palos was electric. Word of Columbus's discoveries had already spread like wildfire, and the town turned out in force to greet the returning heroes. Can you picture it? The ships, battered but afloat, slowly making their way into the harbor, the crowds cheering, waving, and shouting greetings, church bells ringing, flags flying. It was a scene of pure jubilation. Columbus, looking every bit the seasoned explorer, tanned, weathered, and sporting a rather impressive beard by this point, stepped ashore to a hero's welcome. The crew, a motley bunch of sailors who doubted him, grumbled about him, even threatened to kill him, were now basking in the glow of his success. It's funny how things change, isn't it? From Palos, Columbus sent word to King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, the Spanish monarchs who had sponsored his voyage. They were in Barcelona at the time, and they immediately summoned him to court. This wasn't just a formal audience, this was a celebration. The journey to Barcelona was almost a victory parade in itself. Columbus traveled with a small entourage, including some of the Taino people he had brought back from the islands. These were the first indigenous people from the Americas to set foot in Europe in recorded history, and they caused a sensation wherever they went. Think about it. Their lives, their culture entirely changed in a few months. They arrived in Barcelona to an even grander reception than in Palos. The city was decked out in banners and tapestries. The streets were lined with cheering crowds. The Spanish court, in all its finery, was eager to hear about Columbus's discoveries. The audience with Ferdinand and Isabella was a spectacle. Columbus, dressed in his finest clothes, probably still a bit sea-worn, let's be honest, knelt before the monarchs and presented them with the fruits of his voyage. And what fruits they were. Remember, Columbus was convinced he'd reached Asia, so he presented everything as proof of this. He showed them exotic birds with brightly colored feathers, plants and spices that were new to Europe. and of course, gold. Not mountains of gold, mind you, but enough to whet their appetites and confirm the potential of these new lands. He even presented a few indigenous people, dressed in their traditional garments, to further illustrate the wonders of this new territory. Ferdinand and Isabella were thrilled. They saw Columbus not just as a successful explorer, but as a divinely appointed agent of their royal power. They showered him with honors. He was made Admiral of the Ocean Sea, Viceroy, and Governor of the lands he had discovered. Suddenly, all that doubt from before seemed to melt away. He was the man of the hour, the hero of Spain. The treasures Columbus presented were displayed throughout Barcelona, attracting huge crowds. It was a carefully orchestrated PR campaign, designed to showcase Spain's newfound power and wealth. It worked brilliantly. Spain was now a major player on the world stage, all thanks to this one voyage. Of course, the reality behind the triumphant return was a bit more complicated. Columbus hadn't reached Asia. He'd stumbled upon a completely new continent. The gold was just a hint of the vast riches that would eventually be plundered from the Americas, and the encounters with the Taino people, while seemingly friendly at first, would soon lead to colonization, enslavement, and the devastation of indigenous populations. But for now, in that moment of triumph in Barcelona, those darker realities were hidden beneath the surface. Columbus was a hero, Spain was on top of the world, and the future, however uncertain, seemed full of promise, or at least, that's what they wanted everyone to think. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need a nap. The ships have returned. Spain erupts in celebration. The king and queen, Isabella and Ferdinand, are beside themselves. Think about it. They gambled on this crazy Italian with his even crazier ideas about sailing west to reach the east. And it worked. Sort of. They didn't quite get to the Spice Islands, but they did find something. And that something, well, it was enough to justify everything. The expense, the risk, the months of worry. Columbus, now Admiral of the Ocean Sea, is the toast of the kingdom. He parades through the streets, a small collection of indigenous people, Taino, accompanying him, along with strange birds, plants, and a little, very little, really, but it's the promise of gold that truly excites everyone. The immediate aftermath of the voyage is a frenzy of planning. Another expedition is a foregone conclusion. This time, it will be bigger. More ships, more men, more supplies. The goal, to solidify Spain's claim, to establish a permanent presence, and of course to find that elusive passage to the Indies. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. First, there's the small matter of telling the world, or at least part of the world. News of Columbus's voyage spreads like wildfire throughout Europe. The printing press, relatively new technology at the time, plays a vital role. Columbus, or more accurately, people writing for Columbus, publishes letters detailing his discoveries. These letters, quickly translated into numerous languages, become bestsellers. Think about it from a European perspective. For centuries, the world had been largely defined. There were maps, trade routes, established powers, and then boom, a new continent seemingly appears out of nowhere. It challenges everything they thought they knew. It sparks the imagination. It ignites dreams of wealth and glory. Of course, the initial reactions are mixed. Some are skeptical, dismissing Columbus as a liar or a fool. The Portuguese, still smarting from having rejected Columbus's proposal years earlier, are particularly critical. They argue that he hasn't actually discovered anything new, that these lands are simply islands off the coast of Asia. But the Spanish monarchs are having none of it. They are convinced that Columbus has opened up a new chapter in history, and they are determined to reap the rewards. Diplomatic maneuvering begins. Spain seeks papal support to legitimize its claim over these new lands. Pope Alexander VI, himself a Spaniard, obliges, issuing a series of papal bulls that grant Spain exclusive rights to explore, colonize, and Christianize the newly discovered territories. These papal bulls, however, are not universally accepted. Other European powers, like England and France, begin to question Spain's claim. They want a piece of the action too. The seeds of future colonial rivalries are sown. Meanwhile, back in Spain, Columbus is preparing for his second voyage. He knows that this expedition will be crucial in establishing Spain's dominance in the New World. He assembles a much larger fleet this time, 17 ships carrying over 1,200 men. This isn't just a voyage of exploration anymore, it's a voyage of colonization. The crew is a diverse bunch: soldiers, settlers, missionaries, and yes, even more fortune seekers. There are also livestock, seeds, and farming implements. The aim is to create a self-sufficient colony, a foothold for Spain in this new land. But even as Columbus prepares for his triumphant return, there are already whispers of discontent. Some of the men who stayed behind at La Navidad, the settlement established after the Santa Maria ran aground, have begun to tell stories of hardship and conflict. They claim that the Taino, initially friendly, have become hostile due to mistreatment by the Spanish. Columbus dismisses these concerns. He is convinced that he can establish a harmonious relationship with the indigenous people, that they will willingly convert to Christianity and become loyal subjects of the Spanish crown. He genuinely believes he's helping them, bringing them civilization and the true faith. The second voyage sets sail in September 1493. The expectations are sky high. Everyone believes that Columbus is on the verge of discovering untold riches, a new El Dorado. But the reality, as we'll see, will be far more complex and far more tragic. This second voyage, it will solidify the European grasp. But that grasp, it comes with a price paid dearly by the indigenous peoples of the Americas. Columbus may have thought he was bringing paradise, but he was also unleashing a storm of colonization, disease, and ultimately the destruction of entire civilizations. It's a legacy that continues to be debated to this day, a legacy that started, innocently perhaps, with the sight of land after weeks at sea, a legacy that transformed the world forever, and we're only just beginning to understand its full impact. Okay, so Columbus's voyage, it's like a pebble dropped in a pond, you know. The ripples, they just kept going, and they still haven't stopped. It's kind of mind-blowing when you really think about it. He wasn't the first to reach the Americas, of course. The Vikings beat him by centuries. And you know, obviously, the indigenous people were already there, living and thriving. But Columbus, he's the one who kicked open the door for sustained large-scale contact between Europe and the Americas. And well, that contact, it changed everything. For Europe, it was like suddenly finding a cheat code in a video game. New lands, new resources, gold, silver, timber, fertile soil. It fueled the Renaissance, the age of exploration, the rise of powerful nation-states. Spain became the global superpower, at least for a while, and other countries weren't far behind, all vying for a piece of the American pie. This wealth, it paid for wars, built empires, and funded advancements in science, art, and technology. So yeah, from a purely European perspective, Columbus's voyage was a game changer. Like they were playing checkers, and he showed up with a chess set. But that's only part of the story, isn't it? For the Americas, the arrival of Columbus and the Europeans, it was a catastrophe. A slow-motion disaster that unfolded over centuries. I mean, imagine your world being turned upside down overnight. Your land, your way of life, your very existence threatened. Disease, for one. Things that Europeans were relatively immune to, like smallpox, measles, influenza, they were devastating to the indigenous populations. These diseases swept through the Americas like wildfire, wiping out entire communities, sometimes even before the Europeans physically arrived. We're talking death rates of like 90% in some areas. It's almost incomprehensible. And then there was the violence, the colonization, the conquest, the enslavement. The Spanish encomienda system, for example, was basically a system of forced labor where indigenous people were forced to work for Spanish colonizers under brutal conditions. There were countless stories of massacres, forced conversions, and the systematic destruction of indigenous cultures and religions. It's hard to even talk about, really. It's just so awful. Beyond the immediate violence, there was the long-term impact of colonization, the loss of land, the disruption of traditional economies, the imposition of European languages and cultures. It fundamentally reshaped the social, political, and economic landscape of the Americas, often to the detriment of the indigenous people. The effects of these policies, they're still felt today in many indigenous communities. And let's not forget the transatlantic slave trade. To fuel the growing demand for labor on plantations in the Americas, millions of Africans were forcibly taken from their homes and transported across the Atlantic under horrific conditions. This created a system of unimaginable cruelty and suffering that lasted for centuries. The legacy of slavery, it continues to shape race relations and social inequalities in the Americas to this day. The Columbian Exchange, it's a term historians use to describe the transfer of plants, animals, diseases and cultures between Europe, Africa, and the Americas after Columbus's voyage. It wasn't all bad. The introduction of new crops like potatoes and corn to Europe, for example, helped to improve diets and boost population growth. And horses, introduced by the Spanish, revolutionized transportation and warfare for some indigenous groups. But the exchange was uneven. The flow of benefits largely favored Europe, while the Americas suffered the most devastating consequences. It's a complicated legacy. So what do we do with all of this? How do we reconcile the heroic narrative of Columbus with the undeniable harm that his voyage unleashed? Well, I think the first step is to acknowledge the full story, both the good and the bad. We can't just focus on the European perspective and ignore the experiences of the indigenous people and the enslaved Africans who were impacted by colonization. We have to listen to their voices, learn from their history, and acknowledge the pain and suffering that they endured. And we also have to be critical of the narratives that we've been taught, question the myths, challenge the stereotypes, and seek out different perspectives. History is never simple, and it's never just one person's story. It's a complex tapestry woven from the experiences of many different people. Ultimately, the legacy of Columbus is a reminder that actions have consequences, that even well-intentioned actions can have unintended and devastating impacts. It's a call to be more mindful, more compassionate, and more aware of the interconnectedness of our world. It's a reminder that progress, it shouldn't come at the expense of others. Columbus's voyage, it wasn't just a journey across the ocean, it was the start of a new chapter in human history. A chapter filled with both incredible achievements and unspeakable tragedies. And it's a chapter that we're still writing today. So let's make sure we write it with wisdom, empathy, and a commitment to creating a more just and equitable world for everyone. That's the best way to honor the complexities of his legacy. And learn from the mistakes of the past.